Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's digital forum, number 19. Can you believe? I think we've had amazing success with doing our forums online as well as physical. We have 144 of you with us today, so that number keeps climbing. So yeah, just while I'm doing some introductions and housekeeping, hopefully we'll get some more sign up. I can see it ticking up, which is great. Just in terms of forums, we've actually got a couple more this year. So we've got 2 physical forums coming up. We've got the Bristol forum on the 20th of September. And then we've also got a Manchester one on the 22nd of November. So hopefully anybody who's feeling up for getting a physical event in, that'd be great to see you there. We do have another digital forum on the 4th of October as well. So yeah, we're always going to have some good content for you, keep up to date with things and also learn some new bits, hopefully. I'm Natalie Bungay, so I'll be your host today, making sure you're all keeping line and doing some Q&As with the speakers at the end of their sessions. So I'll be with you until the end. A few little bits of housekeeping. So before we do get started, I'll go through the agenda and some other important bits in a moment. But just as a reminder, we get three CPD points for today, including myself. Going to be getting those. So make sure you should have all pre-registered. There's a possibility there's a few of you sat around one computer on one registration. So if that's the case, only the person that registered for this webinar will be getting those points automatically updated on BPCA registered or basis prompt, depending on what scheme you're on. So just remember, get them registered afterwards. Okay, tell us a little story about what you've learned today, and yeah, get those 3 CPD points. Any issues or confusions with it, just get in touch with whichever scheme you're on. I mentioned Q&A session. So basically, listening to the different presentations here, you'll come up with questions, I'm sure, during the presentation towards the end. Just get your question in that Q&A bit. Don't put it in the chat section, put it in the Q&A, because then once we're done, we'll pop those up, have a look through them and try our best to, or the speakers will try their best to get those answered for you. Normally got a good track record with that. So Q&A section for questions for either myself or the speaker, and the chat section, which I think a few of you have put in a few hellos in there already. That's for simply that, you know, saying hi, hello. If you have any technical problems as well, I have a ticking clock on the wall here. I don't think it's interrupting anything, but again, if you think it is, just let me know and put a comment in the chat section. So Q&A for questions to the speakers and chat section for any technical issues or general hellos and where you are in the world. I want to make a special thanks to BASF today for sponsoring this event. Any events we do, whether it's digital or physical, you know, we can't do them without our sponsors and without the speakers that we've got today. So yeah, special thanks to BASF, who's doing a talk today. So after the break, they'll be talking about non-chemical rodent control. So, you know, are snap traps really going to be asking the question, you know, are snap traps a viable replacement for chemical control? Really important subject. And that's mixed in amongst, you know, some other, yeah, really interesting updates and technical items. So we've got Dr. Alan Buckle coming on just after I've finished babbling. He's going to be talking about a CRRU update, always a really hot topic, and you know, important to have your full attention and make sure you're doing the things you should be doing. So Alan will be coming up after me. After Alan at 10:15, we've got Dave Archer from DKA Training. He's going to be dissecting the problems of the modern squirrel dilemma. Certainly, I think most of us here have experienced issues with squirrels. Certainly on a national level, it's a tricky thing. We'll have a comfort break then at 5 to 11 till 5 past 11. Grab a coffee or a cold refreshment, whichever floats your boat, depending on the weather. It's pretty nice here in Derby at the moment, so hoping it stays that way. And then, as I said, after the break, we have BASF talking about the snap traps, and we're following BASF. We've got Will Trivett from Pest Solutions. Will is a member of BY's special interest group, and he's kindly said that he'll come on and do a talk with us on identification, behaviours and the repercussions. So yeah, a bit of biology, behaviour and some good discussions going on. And then towards the end, before we finish off at 20 past 12, we've got Ian Andrew, our CEO, just coming up and giving you some association news and industry updates. Again, really important things there, whether it's glue boards or other bits. So make sure you hang on till the end, and yeah, we'll have you off by 12:30 today. Okay, good. I don't think I can see that there's any issues in the chat section, no sound issues. I think Lauren would have popped up and been told me if there was. The clock's doing well by the seams of it. Yeah, okay, great. Well, if I can ask Dr. Alan Buckle to show himself and unmute, and we can, get started. There you are, Alan.
And I'm hoping you can hear me.
I can hear you perfectly well. Yeah, are you okay? Is it sunny where you are?
It's a beautiful day today and has been for most of the week. Yes, gorgeous.
Yes. We seem to start with the sun and then later on we think, well, no, here comes the rain now. So we like a mixture in this country, don't we?
You do.
Indeed. Great. Well, I'll disappear, Alan, and I'll let you do your crew thing. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll share the screen now.
Yes, please. See your presentation. Fabulous. That's perfect.
How's that? Okay, so hi everybody, good morning. I was asked to do a crew update today. It's been a while since I did one for BPCA. I think the last one was at Harrogate. I'm not sure if I met some of you there. Yeah, it's mainly an update about the stewardship regime because crew doesn't do much else these days, I have to say, other than stewardship. So the topics I'm going to deal with, which are these, are all to do with the stewardship regime, really. Some of you may know the stewardship regime was running in 2016. We were told at the start there'd be a 5-year review, and I'll give you an update, a very brief update on where we are with that 5-year review program. Then a short update on some of the more recent crew monitoring that we've been doing as a part and as a requirement within that stewardship regime. One of the pieces would be on anticoagulant resistance and one on wildlife residues. And then at the bottom there, certainly this will be the first time that I've spoken publicly about this decision, which some of you may have heard about and some may not, about the decision by the crew directors to withdraw all ESCAR use in open areas and in waste dumps. And I'll explain a bit more about how that decision was reached and what it means. So I'll get going. So 5-year review. The first meeting was held in May of 2021, the first review meeting. And this is where representatives of crew, and there's usually 4 or 5 crew representatives go into these meetings, and we meet a large number of government people from HSE, also from all of the other devolved administrations, and also from a number of other expert government organisations such as DEFRA and Natural England. So we meet this group. It's called the Government Oversight Group, or GOG or GOG. So that's the meeting that we had to review the programme on the 12th of May 2021. We wrote a very detailed report. You can see the report has been up on the crew website pretty much, well, since that meeting. And after the meeting, so we discussed the stewardship programme, and after the meeting, or during the meeting, the main comments from HSE were these, and it was essentially that, after 5 years, we can do at the start of stewardship, you've done it. So we put all the structures in place. We did all what we said they asked us to do. So the stewardship was implemented as we said it would be. We had review meetings every year through that 5 years, and each year they told us that the regime was fit for purpose, so they felt it should be able to achieve what we were trying to achieve. But probably the main outcome was it was noted that at the start we'd been set some pretty specific environmental aims, and those aims were all around reducing residues in wildlife, but those aims had not been met. And so at the end of the meeting, it was agreed that there would be more meetings to discuss what might be done to help us to meet those environmental aims to reduce second generation anticoagulant residues, ESCAR residues in wildlife. We had a second meeting. As you can see, it was more than a year after that first one, We didn't write a report for that one. What we did was to write a series of individual reports from the 6 working groups. Some of those are up on the CRRU website. What was then discussed was more about new monitoring data that might help us to meet these environmental targets. Obviously, in December 2022, we're a year on, and those targets have still not been met. Excuse me, sorry. What was decided at that meeting, and these decisions, I think, signal where the government working groups, where the government oversight group and HSE have their concerns. So they decided to set up 4 government oversight group working groups. CRRU has 6. We're now going to have 4 more on the government side, but there will be CRRU representation in each of these working groups. One on resistance, one on monitoring best practice, one on residue monitoring. So we do quite a bit of residue monitoring already. There was concern that there might be things happening out there that our monitoring is not allowing us to see at the moment. And there was discussion as to what more we might do to understand what was going on in the environment with escars. And particularly a species, fox was mentioned as one that we wanted to look at, or HSE wanted to look at. There's another one on sales data. As I come on through the talk, you'll see we lack data in some areas that's hampering our ability to make careful decisions. And HSE sees this and wants to get some more information about the sales and volumes of the different second generation anticoagulants, so we can see what the dynamic is in the marketplace and how those dynamics might be affecting residues that are going into wildlife. So these 4 working groups have been established, and I heard from HSE just yesterday that the intention is that each of those groups will hold a meeting at the end of September. Meanwhile, the regime remains under review. So this 5-year review has been ongoing now. It's been ongoing for 2 years, but in effect, we're still under review. So that's the update on the review process. What I wanted to do now is just to have a look at some of the CRRU monitoring that we've been doing through this programme, particularly to do with, in this case, resistance. I've just got a couple of slides to update you on anticoagulant resistance. What we do is we invite you to send in samples of rat and mouse tails to APHA, Animal Plant Health Agency at Newhaw in Surrey. They are the DNA wizards. You send your tails, we get the results from APHA, and we track them and map them. And you can see this map shows all of the records that we've got from 2009, which is when the University of Reading started to do this, right the way through to 2022. We're still getting lots of tails. We're still getting over 100 a year. And this is showing us that we're getting some new resistance foci. I don't know how many of you are up to speed with these different mutation letters, but there are 3 different rat mutations that are very severe and that have an effect on the efficacy of at least 2 of the second generation anticoagulants. That's difenicum and bromadiolone. Those mutations are very prevalent in the south, and you can see those red spots down there. Those red spots are L120Q. That's the most severe mutation. Y139F is down there in the far southeast, and for some reason it's very difficult to understand, scattered all over the place is this other one, Y139C. Now, because we've been finding more resistance as time's gone on, more resistant rats having one mutation have bumped into a rat carrying another mutation, a different mutation. They've interbred, and so we're getting increasing hybrids where these animals are carrying 2 different mutations, and there's some fairly good evidence emerging that makes them even more resistant than the single mutations would make them. What you can see is in Northern England and Scotland, it's mainly the less severe mutations, the Y139S, which is the Welsh resistant, and the L128Q, which used to be called Scottish resistant because it was first found there. But you can see the yellow boxes, that's L128Q, and there's a pinky color, not many spots of that. That's the Welsh resistance. But there's an outbreak of that up in North Yorkshire and heading into County Durham. What we also find is that there's a fair chunk of the Midland counties. We have very few samples, and we really ask any of you who work in the Midlands, please do send us samples. We've not got very many, but many of those that we do have, sorry, are susceptible. We'd like to know more about that. The very last year that we had, for some reason, quite a few, almost 20 new Y139C foci spread across the country. You can see these maps, they're online at the CRRU website, and we feed all this data into an international resistance monitoring program run by the Rodenticide Resistance Action Committee, and they have an interactive map, and you can go in there, you can put your location, that map will tell you how far you are away from the nearest resistant rat focus, what that is, what that focus is, and what you should do if you are in that area. So this is the map for mice. What you can see is we get very, very many fewer mouse samples over the years. But what we do get is it tells us that 95% of all of the house mice samples that we get carry one of 2 resistance mutations. More and more hybrid resistance is being found, especially in London. With that degree of resistance, the Resistance Action Group of the UK, their advice is to assume that all UK mouse infestation are resistant. Up until last sample, we only found these 2, Y139C and L128S. We now find a new mutation. It's called the Spratus introgression. I won't go further into that. It's found on the continent. It's found in Germany, France, Spain. And for the first time, some mice, an infestation of mice popped up in Hertfordshire carrying that particular mutation. Okay, I'm going to move on now. So we're going to talk now about CRRU monitoring of wildlife residues. CRRU pays for an organisation called the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to collect 100 barn owls every year and to analyse residues in their livers. And so this is the data. You can see we started in 2015, which was the year before stewardship started, and we've done it every year since then. It's done 1 year retrospectively. So the last data I've got here is for owls from 2021. Owls for 2022 are being analysed as we speak, and we will have the 2022 data a little bit later on in the year. It's a bit complicated, and I'll try and cut it down, but what you can see is the blocks and the dark black bar in each of those boxes. That's the mean residue level with some statistical variation. Right down at the bottom right, you can see the data for the sum of all of the escars. So these are the sum of all 5 second-generation anticoagulants. What you can see there, it's gone up and down a bit, but it hasn't statistically significantly changed from the baseline. And the baseline was a number of years running from about 2009 to 2014, I think, something along those lines. So we've got this block of baseline data before stewardship, and then each year we've got this sample from 100 barn owls. And what it's showing is, in spite of all the activities, all the things that stewardship's done, all the changes that have been brought in, the overall residue levels have not changed. But what has changed is their composition. In the top left, you can see just the bromadiolone data. The top right is just the difenycoon data. And the bottom left is the brodifacoon data. There's no individual data for flocoumafen and difethialone because there was very little of those 2 substances used in the baseline years. there's much more of certainly of diphthalone used now, but there was hardly any in baseline, so we don't have a baseline with which to compare our existing data. What you can see, those red stars tell you whether it's significant, highly significant, or very highly significant, depending on how many stars you've got. These are the differences. And what you can see in the top there is actually we've got decreases in the levels of bromadiolone and difenicum. This is reassuring because it does tell us that we can, with our sample, we can get statistically significant results if residues go up and down. But what it shows you down in the bottom is there have been highly significant increases in residue levels in barn owls of brodifacoum. So barn owls are the official sentinel species for the stewardship program, and they're sentinel for all of the species that feed on small mammals, so small mice, voles, and so on. So you can see there at the bottom, we've now got 700 owls over these 7 years. Only 2 of them had residues that were high enough to contribute to their deaths. So what this tells us is that we've got very widespread and not changing residue levels. About 90% of all of the barn owls that we collect out of the 100 carry residues, but very few of them carry residues that are high enough to cause harm to them. But it's showing that there's this quite widespread contamination. Now, the next, just hold on. I seem to have lost a slide there. I wanted to show you a slide on red kites, but that one seems to have gone. I'll see if I can find it perhaps. But the red kite data shows us that an equal number of red kites, about 90%, sometimes up to 100% of red kites are contaminated, but many more of them are dying because of this contamination. About 20% of all of the red kites that are found dead in the UK have residue levels of these second generation anticoagulants that are high enough to have caused them harm and to have killed them. So that was what I wanted to show you with the red kite data. There are some other data that we get, and the Wildlife Incident Investigation Scheme is one that's been ongoing for many, many years, 30 or 40 years. And this is where government officials investigate the bodies of animals that come to them where pesticides are thought to have caused their deaths. And there, this is an independent government-run scheme. And what you can see in the graph there is for bromadiolone, difenicum, and brodifacoum, this is the number of incidents through time involving each of those active substances. And you can see for many, many years, there was a really quite low level of incidents of whiz incidents involving these 3 active substances, all bumbling along, mostly less than 5, and all the same. 2016 is when stewardship starts, and then for some reason in 2019 it's still low, but then in 2020 the number of brodifacoum incidents jumps markedly, and that 2021 dot is actually for only half of 2021. In 2021, there were even more incidents involving brodifacoum. It's very hard to understand this, and some of you may have ideas. I'd be delighted to hear them. This is whiz, and so it's likely that most of these were examples of purposeful abuse. This is when people are trying to kill mostly birds of prey using these substances, or misuse. This is where people accidentally misuse these substances and have these lethal effects on these animals, shown by whiz. The Natural England interpretation of this data jump, I'm not sure that I agree, again, interested to hear what you say, is that those who want to kill purposely birds of prey have in the past used acute insecticides like bendiacarb and carbofuran. Those have been off the market now for so many years that they think that people who want to kill birds of prey have turned to brodifacoum, it may be that our stewardship messages about these substances and how we want to try to cut their residues in wildlife have sort of pointed up the fact that they can be used to cause harm. But certainly that's what's happening. What's also happening is that these are the data from our barn owls again, and it shows that over the year, the proportion of barn owls that have brodifacoum detected in them has increased. Now, this is not likely to be due to abuse. That's because barn owls are not purposely targeted as birds of prey for these criminals to try to kill. And they don't take poison baits that are used to try to kill the targets, which is often buzzards, but also scavenging birds like crows and magpies. So this increase is very unlikely to be associated with that whiz type incident that I showed you. It's more likely to be due to an increase in brodifacoum use across barn owl habitat, wherever that is. Approved use or misuse, we just don't know. Clearly, more people are using brodifacoum. That's the message we're getting. And we're wondering, is this linked to the CRRU's resistance messaging, which is saying that in many places, bromadiol and difenicum don't work. So with that message, it's quite reasonable that people would begin to change over and to use more potent substances like fluclomiphene, diphenthioline, and particularly brodifacoum, because there are so many products on the market that carry that substance. Okay, I think that's the end. Oh, sorry, I don't know what's happened there. There's the red kite slide. And what it shows you is that it's not unexpectedly higher residues are found in dead kites that are found dead than those that are found killed with something else. And we've got 199 kites, and about 40 of those had residues in them that probably killed them. So that's the red kite data. Sorry for that. So now I'm going to start to talk about this decision, which was to withdraw the use of SCARs from the open area and waste dump use scenarios. There has been, and you've heard this now, there's been no consistent reduction in wildlife exposure to SCARs as required by the HSC and by the government oversight group when we set up the resistance regime. And indeed, brodifacoum, one of the most potent anticoagulants, exposure to that has been increasing. Unfortunately, we have very little quantitative information to guide action, and some of the next couple of slides will show you the sort of information that we're wanting. We base lots of what we say on assertions, but I'm sure you'll find that all of these assertions can be open to questions, and there are certainly exceptions to most of the things that we say. However, the Government Oversight Group and other agencies are very concerned about the lack of progress during stewardship. We're thinking that maybe CRRU's resistance messaging is causing an increase in the use of brodifacoum. We didn't think that inactivity was an option, just to carry on doing what we're doing. So what to do was the question. So a decision was made, and that decision was considered over a period of 18 months or so. It was taken at the beginning of this year. Now, it's not a ban as such. It's voluntary action by the CRRU directors. Now, these CRRU directors are representatives of every single company that has an SCAR authorization in the UK, and there are 14 of those. So there are 14 CRRU directors, one for every company that markets SCARs in the UK. It affects only difenicum and bromadiolone, and it affects only those products of those two substances that had open area and waste dump uses on their labels. So this doesn't affect everything. It's an extension of a decision that was made in 2013 by CRRU. It was then decided that no applications would be made for authorizations of brodifacoum, diphenthioline, and fluclomiphene. That should be, not difenicum, apologies. So brodifacoum, fluclomiphene, diphenthioline, the three most potent second generation anticoagulants. There were no authorization applications for those in open air and waste dump use because of environmental concerns. That then has been extended to include difenicum and bromadiolone. So all 5 second generation anticoagulants will not be available for use in open areas and waste dumps. The last sales will take place in July 2024, and there'll be a use-up period through to December 24. So I just wanted to talk through some of the considerations that there were in making this decision, and you'll see what I mean when I talk about uncertainty. So in the center there, we've got eschar contamination in wildlife, and it's that contamination that CRRU and the stewardship regime are set and required to reduce by HSE. What we've got, as I'm sure you all know, we've got 4 different usage groups on farms and in agriculture by farmers mainly, but also by some professional pest managers who go onto farms to do pest control, gamekeepers, general public, and professional pest management. So we don't like to point the finger at people because we don't have very much data as to who it is that is contributing the most to this eschar contamination. But the variables that we thought about would be, of course, the volumes used. Who uses the most of these substances? And it seems sensible that those groups that use the most would be most likely to be contributing the most to the contamination in wildlife. And we got almost no data on that at all. And that's where these volumes come in. And that's why the Government Oversight Group is setting up a working group to look at that so we can get some more information. It's highly confidential commercial information. CRRU can't touch it because of legal issues. It's going to have to be supplied in confidence. But this will help us to understand perhaps how much of these substances are being used by which of these groups. We think that farms and farming uses the most. We think that the general public uses the least, and therefore that might tip the balance in our thinking. Obviously, the other variables would be user group practices and their competence. And so what do we know about the competence of gamekeepers, farmers, professional pest management, and general public? What we know, of course, is that now all of those top 3 have to show competence to buy professional second generation anticoagulants. Obviously, the general public doesn't have to do that. Also, we need to think about areas of use, and the next slide is about that. But who uses the most of these substances in the areas that are most likely to expose wildlife to second generation anticoagulants? And what our thinking is that it's open area and possibly in and around buildings use on farms that is most likely, because that's where most wildlife is. Now, again, I've said exceptions to everything I'm saying. Lots of wildlife in inner cities, everyone knows that. But we're talking about the balance of probability in all of this. So the next slide is, these are the use scenarios that are on labels. Indoors only, in and around buildings, open areas and waste dumps, and sewers. And really the same variables are important. We think that, for example, sewers, very little goes into sewers. What does go into sewers, much of it goes into water, and we haven't been asked to monitor water, but very little is used, and there probably is very little going into wildlife as a result of sewer use. The same for strict indoor only substances. We don't think that would be a very high likelihood to be causing wildlife contamination. So we're looking at in and around buildings and waste dumps. Now, the in and around building use scenarios is incredibly important because it's the one that we most use to protect human health and animal health. And then we looked at this open area and waste dumps. Now, open areas are those far away from buildings and seems to be those that are most interactive with wildlife. So the decision was made that we would try to cut that stream of contamination going into wildlife. That's the areas, that's open areas and waste dumps. So coming to the conclusions now, After 7 years of stewardship, there's no observable reduction in escar wildlife residues, but there are changes in compositions I mentioned to you. Brodifacoum residues in barn is increasing across the UK, not abuse, but likely to be general approved use, misuse. Exposure of wildlife to one of the most toxic escars, Brodifacoum, is increasing. It is resistance having a role to play there. What can we do? More of the same didn't seem an option. Use in open areas presents the most obvious and extreme risk of wildlife exposure. What we knew was that the labels and rules about open area use were confusing. There were only some products containing just 2 escars in which that use was allowed. It's not permitted at all with Brodifacoum, but that's not obvious on labels. And what we have evidence or reports of happening of people going into outlets, buying Brodifacoum products and using them in open areas. They don't look on the label, and you've all looked at labels, very densely packed with text. You've got to look at that label and find something that is not there. Not there is use in open areas, and that's a cause of concern. One of our most important considerations above all was that we want to retain the essential use of escars for protection of human health and animal health in and around buildings. Assessment of alternatives for open areas, there are sufficiently effective alternatives. There's also widespread rat resistance to difenicum and bromadiolone, and it may mean that those substances are no longer fully effective in many areas. The decision that was taken by the CRRU directors allows us to promote a simple message: don't use escars away from buildings. And in that, we hope to work towards a reduction in these wildlife residues for the first time in the 7 years of stewardship. There are some things that need resolution, and we've had multitudes of questions, and I expect you'll have some if I shut up long enough for you to ask them. But with no longer any open area use, the use in and around buildings and its definition becomes more essential. How far can you go with use in and around buildings, and indeed, what is a building? Also, what is a waste dump? These and other questions are the cause of a lot of discussion and deliberations in the CRRU best practice work group. HSE knows we're having those discussions, and the intention is to resolve all of these unresolved questions. We will then go into consultation with HSE, and eventually the CRRU Code of Best Practice will be revised with this new situation with open area and waste dump use, and with the definitions that will allow everyone to know how they can then use escars going forward. I think that's the last slide, Natalie.
Great, fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. There's a lot to go through, isn't it? And trying to get the key messages across. And I think you've done a great job. Thank you so much for that. There are a lot of questions. There's 9 in there. We've got about 7 minutes or so. So I'm gonna try and focus on the ones that I think, you know, the masses are gonna want the answers to, which might be difficult. But so in terms of CRRU's main aim and the stewardship and, you know, reducing residues in birds of these, you know, different active ingredients you've got, I say, why doesn't it? Someone's asking, will CRRU recognise things like cholecalciferol a little bit more, just so that they can achieve this aim in the hierarchy and guidance?
Well, you use the word, or someone used the word recognise. We already do recognise cholecalciferol, so it's sitting there as an active substance that's available and can be used, and is described in the CRRU Code of Best Practice. I know there's plenty of advice around from the manufacturers about how to use cholecalciferol. So it's certainly an important alternative, and some cholecalciferol products do have open area and waste dump uses on the label, and those will remain on the label. So clearly that was one of the alternatives that we looked at when we came to this decision about the alternatives. There are all sorts of other alternatives as well. CRRU doesn't endorse any active substances, and so we just look at what's there, tell people how best to use them.
Great. I think it's based on their own site risk assessment, isn't it? And doing, deciding what's best for them to use.
Well, yes, always that's a given on doing the risk assessment.
Great. I've got someone actually offering possibly some assistance here. Stuart Searle, he said, you mentioned fox monitoring, and how are you looking to gather that data? Because I believe he's a gamekeeper and considered reaching out to Pest to work with the industry to gather these samples.
Yes, I'm sure there'll be more on that. One of these HSE government oversight group working groups is going to look into it. I know there is, in fact, a massive fox sample in Scotland because they've been doing quite a lot of fox shooting. I don't quite remember why they got that sample, but certainly fox is a species that is of interest to the people who want to look at residues, and how we get that sample will be something that government working group will be looking at. And I'm sure gamekeepers will come into consideration. Absolutely. So thanks to whoever that was for the offer, but I'm sure that we will come to that.
Good stuff. There's a few questions around the brodifacoum and the residue level increase, the worrying increase that was seen on there, and just general comments around is this in and around building and the time when it was allowed for in and around buildings rather than just inside. Is that something that might change then, or is there any kind of regrets about having that on in and around buildings?
So I think lots of you know that for a very long time, those 3 potent SCARs were restricted, very, very closely restricted to indoors only. And the definition of indoors in those days was so strict as to make them almost impossible to be used for rat control. That position was held for 30 years. Ours was the only country in the world that had that restriction. Ours is a country that has very severe resistance problems in both rats and mice. It's impossible to tie our advanced resistance situation to that restriction, but it certainly can't have helped. And what happened then, because of this growing resistance situation, HSE felt that it was no longer reasonable to prevent the use, essentially to prevent the use of those 3 substances against rats, and especially resistance rats. So in 2016, that we set up this stewardship regime. The worry always was that with the now use of those 3 substances in and around buildings, we would see wildlife residues of those substances going up. For a few years, we didn't. And we took some heart from that. For the first 3 or 4 years of stewardship, nothing much changed. It didn't go down, but we've made that change, that big change in the use practice, and we weren't seeing things go up. And then suddenly we get this big hike in abuse cases through WIS, mostly abuse, some misuse, I suspect, this big hike. But we see the more gradual increase in brodifacoum in barn owls, which almost certainly is due to increased use of brodifacoum across the board. There is concern, and so there are some in government saying, well, we told you so. We don't like this increase in exposure to the most toxic of the active substances. And so there is quite big concern. And that concern played into the decision of the CRRU directors to withdraw all SCARs from open area use. So in effect, it was not a decision particularly aimed at those 2, difenicum and bromadiolone, that can be used in open areas. It was to try to make sure that we give a simple message: no SCARs away from buildings, and try to stop brodifacoum being used away from buildings and going into wildlife. Yeah. So that was part of the thinking, Natalie.
Yeah. I mean, there is a question in here about something that I also get questions thrown at me. We're just on time. We're meant to be finishing, but I think this is a really important one before we do. So people concerned with the open areas coming off of the label. Does that mean that, for example, they can't treat Mr. or Mrs. Jones's rats down the bottom of their garden where they're not necessarily getting in the building, they're just causing an infestation in their garden?
I don't want to preempt the best practice work group discussions on this, but what I would say is it's very clear. In and around buildings means that you can put baits in and around buildings to both control rodents that are in the buildings and to control rodents that you think and believe may go into buildings. That use, it wouldn't make sense only to permit in and around building use, only when the rodents are already in the building, because that's exactly what you're trying to prevent. So there is this prevention concept that if you have rodents close enough to a building that you believe that there's a risk that those are already going to the buildings or will go into a building, then you're allowed to bait them in and around buildings.
Fabulous. Good. Thank you for that as well. You got a good answer out in 1 minute, so that was appreciated. Thank you, Alan.
Can I just say
yeah,
that's certainly one of the things that will be spelled out more clearly by the best practice working group, because that question has come to us in various guises with pictures and maps and all sorts of things. Can I do it here? Can I do it there? And so there will be a much more measured response to that question, which is of course very important now. It's in fact a question, how far from a building can I go and still use the in and around building scenario? And that is something that we're going to have to explain very carefully to everybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as always, everybody listening, you know, you can always give BPCA a call and we can chat about it. And once we have close contact with Alan as well. And yeah, we'll help anybody that needs help as much as we possibly can, but that guidance will be out. There are 7 open questions, just don't have time to get through them, Alan. I think you can see the Q&A section, can't you, Alan? I don't know if you're okay to go in there. You can actually type an answer to some of them. If you don't mind doing that, that'd be amazing.
Okay, I'll have a go at that for sure.
Fabulous. Great. Thanks again, Alan. And yeah, fabulous presentation for us today. Take care.
Thank you.